everything that we do in here is very near and dear to me. Got worked in many different domains, including healthcare, insurance, banking. And what I've done with my career is very achievable and doable. So we do lots of these training sessions in smaller pieces and chunks because I really want you guys to understand the small pieces that go into making and delivering IT projects. And it actually is it's a very rewarding career choice. And you, at the end of the day, you get to build systems that live on forever. So that to me has been very exciting. And I wish to share my experience and my career with you guys and help you guys transition and be successful in your careers as well. So today's topic, by popular demand, is what documentation do we do in the waterfall scenario, in the waterfall projects, or in Agile? So two most widely used project methodologies in today's software development lifecycle, I've seen Agile and Waterfall. Waterfall is our traditional way of implementing IT projects. Agile is very, very new. It's very nimble, very flexible. Lots of companies are trying to transition to Agile, but you'll sometimes find that they're in a hybrid mode, meaning that they'll do some things in Agile, they'll do some things in Waterfall, but it's important to know how to implement and what type of documentation you may be required to produce if you're working in that environment. So I've created a slide for you. Let me share my screen. This one. So what documentation would you be working on if you were working as in the waterfall or the Agile environment? This is a diagram that I created a few years ago, maybe, and I pulled it up for this training session. This is what your software development lifecycle should look like in the waterfall scenario. So in the waterfall, you have something called planning, analysis, design, implementation, meaning coding. This is where your developers are coding, and then test. And everything that you see in the dark blue areas or boxes or triangles are documentation, documentation or a piece of paper or document that gets reviewed, that gets created by business analysts and is reviewed and approved by stakeholders and leadership. Okay, and we'll go through what all of this means in just a little bit, but I wanted to have you guys take a look at this picture. And this is why in the waterfall scenario, our projects take anywhere from 16 to 18 months, because all of this stuff is done ahead of time, meaning you need to do lots of this documentation, at least up to design, before coding can start, right? And that's why our projects take, in the waterfall scenario, take a very, very long time. Like, for example, you need to plan out exactly what your project is going to look like. You have to define scope. All those requirements have to be defined in the analysis phase. We have to design what this product looks like, and then coding can start. And then what that means is typically coding itself can take anywhere from 2 to 3 months, depending on the size and complexity of your project. And then you go into something called user acceptance testing. Okay, and in the Agile environment, we typically have a vision of what we want our product to look like. We're typically very clear on what the MVP looks like, which is a minimal viable product. And then once we know, have an understanding of what our MVP looks like, we build that out. And then we have subsequent releases or sprints thereafter to keep building and improving that product. So that product typically will take more than what the timelines look like for waterfall in the Agile environment. But when we build something using the Agile methodologies, that product is very well received because it's got continuous improvement and customer feedback. So it becomes a very stable product once it is delivered. Does that make sense, you guys? Okay, so let's talk about waterfall, then I'll talk about Agile, and then we'll finish it up with any questions you guys may have. So this is waterfall. You start with planning, and as a business analyst, you're typically helping out with creating a project charter, sometimes, sometimes project managers do the project charter or the requirements management plan. All organizations are different. So it could be a BA, it could be a PM, but it would be a good idea for you guys to recognize what these documents are. If you need templates, go Google them. Google will always be your best friend. I still rely on Google, and sometimes I don't know what terms I'm hearing. Sometimes they're industry specific, but in terms of standard documentation, go find them on Google. You'll find lots of templates. Some may look very different than others, but at least you'll have a general sense of what these documents look like and what type of information goes into these documents. So do that just to prep. After planning, then we go into analysis, and this is where a business analyst do business process modeling diagrams. These are workflow diagrams, and we use them to document our as is and to be workflows. And those typically are extremely helpful. You could be using your use case diagrams in here. And all these tools, when we talk about business process modeling diagrams, is to help us understand what it is that we're building, help our customers understand what the end-to-end flow looks like. I've been in many stakeholder meetings with my customers where sometimes they know what product they want to build, but they don't understand how it's going to interact with the whole ecosystem of the company, right? So, hey, Miss Mary Jo, how is what we're building like integrated with the overall what we do here at MetLife, for example, right? So those are things when you start to do modeling diagrams, helps your customer understand. They may know it, they may not either be saying it or understand it completely, but doing these workflows really helps your customers, really helps your dev folks, right? People who are going to be programming the system, your QA folks, and you as a business analyst, okay? So we take those and we put them in something called a business requirement document. We also have something called a functional requirement document. So those are two pieces of documentation that requires sign off from your stakeholders. Then we go into prototyping, which is creating either high fidelity or low fidelity mockups on what your system should look like. It should have screen layouts. It should have user flows, typically what you've done in our workflow diagrams at a very low fidelity. This should have, okay, on this screen, our users should have this report, and then they should have the ability to maybe print these reports out or send them in via email. So some of those things will be laid out so our customers could have a visual representation of what the system may look like. Then we have something called a requirements traceability matrix. And all that is you'll take your requirements document, and what you'll do is you'll put it in Excel and you'll number it. And then what the goal of a requirements matrix, requirements traceability matrix is to make sure all of our requirements that our stakeholders gave to us are ones that we're going to deliver. Because we have lots of requirements, or sometimes our requirements, our BRDs, can be 50 to 100 pages long, right? And so it becomes very easy when you're not, for example, lots of companies are still using Microsoft Word to document business requirements. So it becomes very easy to miss requirements. So the requirements traceability matrix is just an Excel spreadsheet most of the time, where you number all of your requirements and then you match them to your test plan to make sure that we're testing everything that's in our BRD. And then we also sometimes, match it up to our UAT test scripts to make sure that we're delivering everything that we said we were going to in this BRD document. Okay. So you're doing prototyping. We've covered the requirements matrix, requirements traceability matrix. Then we have something called a test plan. So for BAs, a test plan can be very simple in saying that we're going to be testing these requirements and have high level, so your QA folks will create your test scripts, which are very detailed, instructions on how to test each and every functionality. From a BA standpoint, you're required to create something called a test plan that talks about how you as a business analyst and how your customers or your key stakeholders that gave you input will be testing this project, right? So that's the whole goal of a test plan. is to make sure that you have identified a plan for your stakeholders. So typically on a project, you'll have 5 or 6 key stakeholders, meaning that there's 5 or 6 departments using this tool, right? And so your test plan should include, how does department A, B, C, D, E, and F plan to test for this project? When will they be testing? How will they be testing? Will you be providing training for them? Are we going to have continuous 5 days of testing? Or are we going to leave it open for 2 weeks for anybody to go in and play around and like give us bugs, identify bugs? And if no bugs, then we approve it, which is typically not how it's done. Typically, you'll set 1 week of testing and you'll make it a requirement for each of your teams that have provided input to go in for a specific time frame or to do end-to-end testing. And this is where we'll find majority of our bugs, is when our UAT testing is happening. So what I just described is what typically happens in UAT. Okay, that was a lot of information. You guys have questions on this?
No, I'm good.
Okay, good. So everything else that is not in blue is still are still items or documentation that happens, but it's not something that business analysts are responsible for. The ones highlighted in blue are the ones that our business analysts would be doing. So in Agile, so there's lots of documentation in Agile as well. Lots of times when you read, how to do projects in Agile, what you'll find is that they talk about the lack of documentation, which is kind of not true. It is true to an extent because there is less documentation required in Agile, but there is what we call just-in-time documentation, meaning that we're not planning stuff out at the very beginning of the project and then going by the plan. We are, documenting things as we need to. So in Agile, as I mentioned, you'll have different releases, right? So sometimes 3 sprints can make up a release, right? These are in a release, we're releasing functional not documentation, functional, how do I call this? In each release, you are giving out or delivering something that is functional, right? So it could be a login screen or a login mechanism. It could be you're allowing your customers to do registration. You're in a release, you're doing something that's functional. It's not half-baked, right? So that's the definition of a release. So in each sprint, as we're doing this documentation, but before we get to the sprint, at the very beginning of the project, we need to have a product vision or a project charter, which we have typically in the waterfall scenario as well. And then at the very beginning, we need to identify the technical architecture or the tech stack that we'll be using. So typically what happens is when we start a new, we have a project that's approved. We're thinking that we want to do Agile, and Agile is not something that you can go into work one day and your team decides that now we're going to start doing projects in Agile. It's a huge transition from waterfall. So if your company is a waterfall shop, then your company is a waterfall shop. If your company is an Agile shop, it's an Agile shop. Sometimes, very often, we'll see that they're trying to transition to Agile, and they're kind of getting stuck. So it'll be an hybrid model. So it's not like you're going to get assigned to a project and all of a sudden it's going to be Agile, right? It just doesn't happen that way. But in Agile projects, or even in things that we're thinking will be in a hybrid model, typically we'll talk about what the project is, the developers will come in board, and we'll talk about, what technology are we going to use. So we'll have a very, very high level technical architecture or talk about the technical stack that we'll be using for this project. And that happens at the very beginning, right? And then ongoing efforts, as we're going through each sprint and each release, these are things that we will be working on. So these are called just in time. We'll have a product backlog. We'll have a sprint backlog. We'll be documenting user stories and including the acceptance criteria. We'll be doing our test scripts and test plans. We'll be documenting our use case diagrams, workflow diagrams, technical documentation, and all of that fun stuff as we're going through the motions of finishing up these sprints, right? Technical documentation, our developers, people that are programming our software, they're supposed to go back and document it as they're building it out, right? So typically in the waterfall scenario, once we're done with prototyping, this is where our systems analysts or developers will be documenting our technical requirements, right? And in Agile, they're supposed to be doing it as they're coding those items, because the thought process is it's fresh in their mind, and it, because they're coding it, shouldn't take them that much longer to just complete their technical documentation as they're coding their functionality or the user stories that they're assigned to. Does that make sense, you guys? Okay. And then
Yes.
I have another document. So this is another training that I've done in this group previously. If you wanted to find it, you could go back in the past videos and look for it. This talks about the sign-off requirements, right? So when you're in Waterfall, who needs to sign off on your documentation? So you're creating all this documentation. You guys need to understand who's your audience for these documentation and who's going to sign off on it. So in the waterfall scenario, planning, if you're doing your project charter or requirements management plan, it's so for your project charter, it's going to be your project sponsor, leadership of key stakeholders, meaning so if there's 5 departments that are impacted that are going to be giving you inputs, the leadership of those departments are going to be signing off on the project charter. And what that means is that when you have signed off on a project charter, your project is official, and having those key stakeholders, leadership of key stakeholders sign the project charter means that they're giving you permission to talk to their team members as a collaborative project. So that's what that means. Requirements management plan, your project manager typically is the owner of this. So if they're not creating it and you are as a BA, then just your project manager will need to sign off. In analysis, we do something called a BRD. The people that sign off are your project sponsor, project manager, leadership of key stakeholders, dev leadership, and QA leadership. So it's very important. People miss this. Your requirements document, your dev and QA leadership needs to sign off because now they're committing to doing this project with the scope that's listed, right? Then your requirements traceability matrix, typically, if you're doing it as a BA, your project manager should sign off. It's not an official required sign off, but your project manager should look at it and make sure that it's completed correctly. And change requests, if they're coming in after sign off is completed, project sponsor, project manager, leadership of key stakeholders, dev and QA leadership. Test plans, typically we don't need an official sign off. Change request, again, if they're happening, anytime change requests happen after analysis, you need a whole bunch of people to agree and sign off. Testing for UAT, leadership of key stakeholders, and again, change request again. And I put change request purposely in each of the different phases after analysis because change requests in the waterfall scenario are a big deal, you guys. They're not fun. They require a lot of work, and that's just how things are in waterfall. Okay. And in Agile, this is our Scrum. This is what our typical sprint looks like. And we also have deliverables, right? So for our product backlog, again, in Agile, we don't really have formal sign-offs as we do in Waterfall, but still documentation is required. So you have your product backlog, your product owner, your stakeholders approve that, your sprint backlog, product owner, and stakeholders. Typically, stakeholders don't get involved. It's typically just your product owner. But again, depending on different organizations, your stakeholders could have more of an active role than, not. But again, it depends on the organization. I've seen on the projects that I worked on, our product owner and our stakeholders were heavily involved. But again, depending on the organization that you're in, you could see that the product owner takes the lead on these. For analysis, we'll say these are user stories, our product owner or scrum master. Refinement of user stories could include workflow diagrams, use cases, and etc. And then for test plans and UAT, we have something called acceptance criteria. I've missed that in this chart. But typically when you're designing your user stories, you would include your acceptance criteria. And last week, we did a whole session on creating user stories and how to document acceptance criteria. So if you missed that, go back and watch that. And that's the end of the show, you guys.
Not related to this, but I have a question that about requirement prioritization. And I understand about the agile, but I don't understand why we prioritize in waterfall.
We do because sometimes you may have requirements. So remember, I said your requirements, you need to get sign off from your dev leadership and QA leadership. Sometimes, even though we're building the same product, there may be lots of bells and whistles that our stakeholders are wanting. So what we try to do even in Waterfall is we try to prioritize requirements to say these are the must-haves even in Waterfall. These other things, maybe we can put them in a phase 2 if we're running short on timelines. But if we're not, we'll go ahead and work on these. But in the event that we're not able to deliver all of these requirements, you still need to have some sort of prioritization, right? To make it easier for our teams to say, okay, focus on these first 20 requirements, the next 5 we'll work on as time permits. So that's the goal.
So that means when we were planning, because as if I understood correctly, the waterfall in waterfall we think that this much time will take and this much budget we require for that project, right?
Yeah.
So if you're saying that like we are doing the prioritization because we may not be able to deliver it, so that means we are thinking that might be our planning for the timing is not right.
No, because sometimes what happens is when we document requirements and we get sign off, when people or when sometimes what happens is when they start to code documentation, when they start to code the program, they may find that the functionality is pretty complex, or they need to connect with different databases or whatever the case may be, right? They may find that they're having a difficult time meeting those things in the timelines that we have. And for that situation, typically it doesn't happen, but for that situation, we want to identify what the highest functionality that we need to release with is. So that's the reason. Most of the time, it doesn't end up that way, but sometimes when they start coding, things may be more complex than they first thought it would be. So that's the reason why even in Waterfall, we want to go ahead and identify which functionality, prioritize the highest to lowest.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, guys, I saw that a few more folks joined. We are unfortunately at the end of the session. You guys can go back and watch the replay. I'll be also loading this on YouTube, so you can watch it there as well. All right. Thank you, guys. Bye.